Welcome back. My book, Compost Science for Gardeners, has been converted to an audiobook. The narrator is David Skalsky, and I think you'll enjoy listening to part of this book, Compost Science for Gardeners.
7. Easy composting. So far in this book, I have described more formal ways to compost, and all of them are great. But they tend to be more work than some of us want to do. This chapter will focus on other techniques that are perhaps more suited to the lazy, or is that smart, gardener. Cut and drop method. About 15 years ago, I moved to a 6-acre property and started developing a large botanical garden. One of the first tasks was to build a traditional 2-bin compost system. It worked great, but I found that it was a lot of work moving material from the garden to the pile. And then in spring, I needed to move it back to the garden again. To save time, I started using the cut and drop method, and I love it. I now use this technique for 95% of my yard waste. The method is simplicity itself. Wherever you are in the garden, leave the plant waste where you stand. I do most garden cleanup in spring. My hosta leaves are already on the ground from winter. They stay there. The old hosta flower stems might still be vertical, so I take some hedge trimmers and cut them off, about 6 inches at a time. The cuttings are left where they fall. Any other dead foliage is treated in a similar way. Just cut it and drop it. An exception to the rule is some tall ornamental grasses that make thick stems. I can't be bothered cutting them all up into small pieces, so I cut them off at ground level and haul them to a compost pile. I also treat rose bushes differently. I cut those back and put the cuttings in our municipal green bins. I hate thorns. If I am deadheading or cleaning up plants in summer, I just cut and drop. If the plant is near the front of the bed, I fling the cut piece behind a larger plant at the back to keep things looking neat. In fall, all leaves are left where they drop, provided it is in a flower or shrub bed. On the grass, I either mow them into small bits and leave them, or rack them into a nearby flower bed that needs some extra organic matter. I don't rake them very far. Most weeds are either annuals or perennials that don't spread by runners. All of these are just pulled and dropped into the garden bed. If I have concerns about them rooting, I will leave them on the garden path for a couple of days to dry out in the sun, and then I throw them into the flower bed. There are exceptions. Invasive weeds like bindweed, quackgrass, and Canadian thistle are not returned to the garden. They are just too nasty. They either go out with the garbage or they are dropped on the lawn to die. What about lawn grass that invades flower beds? I pull it out and toss it onto the lawn. It either dies or roots. Either is okay with me. Nature has been composting organic matter that sits on the surface of the soil for thousands of years. Why not let her take care of the composting for you? Thank you, Mother Nature. Cut and drop method, pros and cons. Pros: very easy and no worry about the carbon-nitrogen ratio. Nothing to buy. Cons: can look a bit messy in very early spring, but plant growth soon hides it all. Leaf mold. Leaf mold is made by piling up leaves in the fall and leaving them alone. Since leaves have a high carbon-nitrogen ratio, 60:1, they decompose slowly and the pile stays cold. Most of the decomposition is done by fungi rather than bacteria. The fungi tend to come from underground and grow their mycelium up into the leaf pile where it decomposes the high-carbon material. The end result is a combination of broken-up leaves and white mycelium, which makes great compost. It is best to use it in the garden as mulch. The process can take 2 years in colder climates, but shredding the leaves, keeping them moist, and adding nitrogen will speed up the process. fall leaves are fairly low in nutrients since the tree removes some nutrients before the leaves drop. Piles of leaves can also be messy, especially in windy locations. To help with this problem, the pile can be contained in a wire cage, as described in the previous chapter. Leaf mold, pros and cons. Pros: easy to make, good soil amendment. Cons: takes a long time, can be messy in a windy location. Pit and trench composting. Nature can compost material all on its own by leaving it on the ground, but many people don't like to see the uncomposted material. A simple solution is to bury it. A pit is a round hole, and a trench is a longer rectangular hole, but they are the same technique. Find a suitable spot in the garden and dig a hole big enough to hold the material you have. Fill the hole with compostable material and cover with soil. If the material is high in carbon, you can add a bit of nitrogen, urea, blood meal, etc. Then forget about it. The microbes and earthworms in the soil will soon find the material. Over time, it decomposes and is absorbed into the soil. Nutrients will migrate out of the hole into the surrounding soil where plants will find them. The plants will also grow roots right into the compost once it is finished enough. This technique is not really suitable for producing compost that you want to use somewhere else. In my very first vegetable garden, I used raised beds without sidewalls. The pathways were used as a trench, and I slowly filled them with yard waste. In the following year, I would empty the pathway and place the finished compost on the beds, ready to start all over again. If you plan to trench the material near other plants, especially vegetables, it is a good idea to dig the trench early in the season before plant roots grow into the space. You don't want to dig a trench near a tomato plant mid-season and harm the roots. The system works well for smaller quantities of material like your kitchen scraps. It is more difficult to deal with large quantities of material this way. Pit and trench composting, pros and cons. Pros: easy system to use. Works well for kitchen scraps and small amounts of yard waste. Cons: need to find places to dig up in your garden. Less suitable for large quantities of organic material. Keyhole composting. Keyhole gardening is both a composting method and a gardening method. I am going to describe the more traditional design of this method so you understand the whole concept, and then I'll describe some variations that are easier to use. The whole thing starts by building a special keyhole garden, which is a circular raised bed that contains a center composting area. One side of the circle has a pie slice cut out of it so that you can reach the center. I guess the term keyhole comes from this shape, but I don't really see a keyhole. If you Google keyhole gardens, you will find many different designs for such a garden. The raised bed can be any height, and the wall can be made out of any material, including rocks, bricks, or even wood. It does not even have to be a circle. It could be a square with one side indented to allow access. The garden can also be domed with the center higher than the walls. The center composting area is some type of cylinder or cage that can hold material. I have seen people use wire mesh, steel drums, and plastic buckets. The requirement here is that the bottom is left open, so the compost sits on the soil, and the sides should have lots of holes to allow soil organisms access to the organic matter. This design is essentially a garden built around a composting cage. New organic matter is added into the top of the cage as you collect it. It slowly moves down as older material decomposes. Nutrients leach out the side into the garden, and macroorganisms can move from the soil into the compost for a snack. The cage itself is either never emptied or only emptied every few years. This composting process is quite simple, but making the garden is more work. There are ways to simplify the system and still retain most of its benefits. The raised bed can be only a few inches high and made with a single row of bricks. The center compost pit would need to be lowered so composting happens below grade. Keyhole gardening will also happen even if the garden bed is not raised, or raised a few inches with no wall around it. The main point is to have a garden all the way around the composting pit so that the whole garden benefits from leached nutrients. This is an interesting idea, but I think it has some fundamental flaws. The claim is that nutrients flow from inside the cage into the surrounding soil. Although this will happen to some extent, most nutrients move down in soil, not sideways. Plant roots live mostly in the top 6 inches of soil. That means plants won't get most of the nutrients. Reports that I have seen show plants doing equally well over the whole garden, but you would expect the ones near the center to do much better if they were getting nutrients from the compost. So I suspect the plants are getting their nutrients mostly from the original soil and not from the compost. Raised beds dry out faster and therefore require more watering. If you would like to build one of these gardens, consider building it very close to grade and don't raise it up more than 6 inches. The compost cage in the center should be placed at grade, so most of the material is above the garden and it should have a solid bottom. These changes will reduce watering requirements and increase the nutrients that make it to plants. Keyhole composting, pros and cons. Pros: easy composting. Cons: nutrients will leach deep into soil away from plant roots. Requires more watering. Structure needs to be built. Electric composters, also called food digesters. I first saw an electronic composter for sale about 6 years ago, and now there are at least a dozen models on the market. These devices grind kitchen scraps and heat them up to drive off the water, producing a compact form of the kitchen scraps. Some systems require the addition of other ingredients, like coir, crushed coconut husk, and some even promote the idea of adding microbes. The newer systems don't require either of these. These systems make the following claims. They compost your food scraps. They turn food into fertilizer. They reduce the volume of food scraps. These devices do not compost anything. They grind and dry your food. Any such product that claims to be composting is misleading its customers. Their process takes a few hours, and composting takes weeks and months. Many of the products claim to grind the food as it is being heated. The blades in the unit are not sharp enough, nor is the space between the blades and the fixed bar small enough to grind food. They rotate once per minute, and at best this can be called agitation. This is also very clear when you look at the results. The material is not finely ground and contains a lot of stringy material. It is unclear what these devices produce. I have talked to several manufacturers, and none have given me a clear answer. Instead, they use a lot of marketing gibberish. As far as I can tell, these devices produce dehydrated kitchen scraps. It is not fertilizer, it's certainly not compost, and it is only partially ground up. I was able to get some analytical data from one company that seems to be more ethical than most, the Vitamix Food Cycler. They show the NPK of the ground food to be 2.9, 0.2, 0.8. The 2.9 is the total nitrogen, and the available nitrogen is 0.005%, confirming that composting has not yet started. Commercial food digesters are expensive to buy and require electricity to run. Most units have some type of odor filters that need to be replaced every 6 months, and they are not cheap. The products recommend adding the dehydrated kitchen waste directly to your potted plants, but I would not do that. Since it is not decomposed yet, it will draw nitrogen away from plants to start that process. When I tried mixing it with soil, the material rehydrated and started to grow a lot of mold. It would be much better to add this material to your composting system or use it as mulch. Electronic composters, pros and cons. Pros: can be used indoors. Finished product can be stored and used on indoor plants. It is an option for indoor processing of kitchen scraps in cold weather. Cons: handles very small amounts of material, not suitable for quantities of yard waste. Very costly for the quantity they are able to process.
I hope you enjoyed this excerpt from my book, Compost Science for Gardeners. If you'd like to learn more about composting, have a look at this collection of videos right here.